Welcome to Babel, Translating the Middle East, a podcast from the Middle East program at CSIS. Here on Babel, we take you beyond the headlines to take a closer look at what's happening in the Middle East and why it matters. This week on Babel, I speak with Dr. Sanam Vakil, director of the Middle East and North Africa program at Chatham House, a think tank in London, and a lecturer at the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies for almost 20 years. Together, we talk about the fallout from President Raisi's death, how Gulf states are likely to react, and the feasibility of U.S. policy options going forward. Then I continue the conversation with Natasha and Leah Hickert to discuss what's next for Iranian foreign policy and what opportunities there are for the United States. To translate some of what's happening in the Middle East, this is Babel. Sanam, welcome to Babel.
Thanks for having me, John.
After Ibrahim Raisi and Hossein Amir Abdullahian died in a plane crash about a week ago, a lot of analysts suggested that it really wouldn't have any impact on Iranian policy, either domestically or internationally. Do you agree with that?
Well, yes and no. I think the truth is always somewhere in the middle. And that's because, on the one hand, the Islamic Republic is a system that is relatively cohesive, but historically, of course, it's made up of various factions that have different policies and tactics, but together they're united in their loyalty for the Islamic Republic. So Raisi himself was a very loyal insider man, not deeply charismatic or beloved by the Iranian population. And he was sort of Khamenei, the supreme leader's yes man, if you will. So those that thought that not much would change are sort of anticipating that another yes man will be elected into the job in the very carefully curated political process that exists in Iran. But the other side of the equation is that getting Raisi into the presidency hasn't been an easy or fluid process. Ibrahim Raisi has worked up and through the system. He has a very checkered and contested history. He has been on a death trial in the 1980s that sent thousands of Iranians to jail, but he's held close positions that indicate he is trusted within the system, but he wasn't very well known. He ran for the first time as president in 2017. Not many Iranians knew him. He didn't win, but that was sort of his first time to the sort of electoral party. Then he won in 2021 and became president. So it was a process. It wasn't an immediate outcome where he was put into the job. I don't think that there is a natural successor for Ibrahim Raisi. And that's why we have to see his death as an opportunity for contenders and a challenge for the system.
Do you see trends already underway in Iran that were either slowed down or sped up by Raisi's death?
Not quite yet. I think it's still too early to say. It has been a long week, and the system has put on a lot of pomp and circumstance, really tried to commemorate his death through mourning ceremonies across the country. And we saw a lot of Iranians coming out to celebrate and commemorate his life, as well as perhaps to show loyalty to the system. I think what we will see in the coming weeks is a carefully curated process where the system tries to show unity as well as demonstrate its business as usual. And the next few weeks will be about candidates putting their names forward, the Guardian Council vetting those candidates, and elections to be held really quite quickly on June 28th.
You mentioned that Iran has complicated factional politics. There are a lot of contending schools, often checking each other. What should we be looking for, especially in succession politics?
Over the past few years, Ali Khamenei has seen a conservative consolidation of power. He has overseen this process, and that's what it looks like from the outside. Today, in Iran's elected and unelected institutions, they are all dominated by conservatives and hardline conservatives that are quite close to the supreme leader and loyal to the supreme leader. This includes Iran's parliament, but also obviously the presidency, as I already mentioned. How this has come about is that in previous elections, and particularly in the 2021 elections, pragmatic conservatives and reformist politicians did not pass Guardian Council vetting. And the Guardian Council vets candidates in advance of elections and makes sure they have the appropriate requirements. Loyalty to the regime and to the supreme leader is among them. And in that process, some key figures have been blocked from running, including longtime politicians or longtime advisors of the supreme leader, like Ali Larijani, for example. So this is how these elections are curated to determine outcomes. And going into this election, we have to look to see if reformist or moderates around, let's say, former President Hassan Rouhani try to run. And then secondly, if they're permitted to run. And then others that are from important families like the Larijanis or former politicians that have been marginalized or taken advisory roles like former President Mahmoud Ahmadinejad. These are people that are rumored to be considering throwing their hat into the ring.
Do you see any shift imminent in the relative power of the clerical establishment versus Revolutionary Guard? There are some people who think that the clerical establishment is likely on its way out. The Revolutionary Guard is likely to accrue more power. Of course, both groups express their loyalty to Ali Khamenei, the supreme leader. Do you see anything potentially happening here that might signal where that's headed, either because some groups make moves, some groups try to consolidate control, some groups demonstrate their weakness?
So I see the factions in Iran as more cohesive rather than independent. And I think that they all are rather beholden to the Iranian supreme leader. I see the IRGC as very intimately connected to Ali Khamenei. They both came up and grew and developed power and influence together. But the clergy also, hardline clerics have certainly hinged their wagons to Ali Khamenei's rise and remained influential. It's those that are reformists or pragmatists that are looking to transform the system or liberalize the system that have been marginalized. I don't see opportunities for those seeking transformational change to rise up in this process, but there have been suggestions from certain analysts, particularly those who would like to see a transformed or liberalized Iran, that this is the time. If Ali Khamenei would like to build bridges with marginalized factions, with reformists, with former President Hassan Rouhani, this is the time to do it. But I think we have to assess Ali Khamenei for his track record. He is not a compromising individual. He's quite stubborn to change. And I would be very surprised if he looks to build those kind of bridges across the factions and with the population. Right now, this is a man that's focused on conservative consolidation and transition of the Islamic Republic, which is certainly going to be slow going because he looks quite healthy. I watched a lot of videos of him over the course of the funeral, and he's quite agile and seemed to be on top of his game.
So let me ask about the foreign policy aspects of this. Iran's foreign minister, Hossein Amir-Abdollahian, was also in the helicopter with him. He was thought to have decent relationships with many of the Gulf leaders. He worked with them over years. He was an Arabic speaker. Do you see his departure from the scene having any impact on Iran's regional standing? Is Ali Bagheri Khani, the acting foreign minister now, different in some way? And is he likely to stay?
That's, I think, a really key point. I think Abdullahian wasn't well loved across the region, but he did have that network that he has very deliberately cultivated, particularly since he became foreign minister. And I think those relationships, particularly in the Gulf, are important, personal relationships. So I think he is a bigger loss for the foreign ministry. But Ali Bagheri Khani is very ambitious. He was in charge of the nuclear negotiations, had more direct contact with American officials through the indirect negotiations taking place in Muscat. He won't be able to immediately build back those networks, although he will try, but he can step up and build that sort of continuity in Iran's regional dynamics, which have been sort of the important developments for the Islamic Republic over the past few years. Ebrahim Raisi and Abdullahian have succeeded in breaking Iran out of maximum containment and for the Iranian state, those political and possible economic relationships are really important to keep the Iranian economy afloat and to build stronger political ties across the region.
You've spent a lot of time talking to people in the Gulf about their perceptions of Iran. How do you think the Gulf states are likely to react? Are they likely to see this as more of an opportunity, more of a threat? And are there different likely reactions from different states?
Of course, they have different personal and interpretational views of the Islamic Republic, but most Gulf bureaucracies and leaders see the center of power and decision-making in the office of the supreme leader. So I think they know very well that Raisi and Abdullahian don't have that independent foreign policy dynamic. But going forward, most of them are going to continue to develop relationships across the Iranian system. It's quite difficult because there are sort of protocols attached, but they are going to continue to prioritize the bilateral relationships that are underway, looking to use these sort of nascent ties to build incremental trust and also use what limited leverage they have over Iran to try and temper risk, manage tension points in the relationships, which are primarily regional and primarily over Iran's support for the axis of resistance groups, Hezbollah, the Houthis, groups in Iraq, as well as in Syria. And they see that direct diplomacy is a better way forward.
Almost exactly 3 years ago, you co-wrote a paper that argued for the need for a regional security framework. Is that still your view? And if that is your view, how should we proceed on it?
It is still very much my view. The region remains the only area of the world that doesn't have an architecture where countries can manage conflict and communicate all together. There are different forums that do exist. The Arab League is one, the Gulf Cooperation Council is another. But obviously, because tensions across the Middle East have been so frayed for decades now, and the idea of bringing Iran and Israel together in a forum seems almost impossible, most of these discussions haven't resulted in any progress. What my co-author and I, Dalia Dasake, proposed after quite a bit of research and workshops and conversations was that regional states, starting from the Gulf as well as Turkey, Jordan, Egypt, and Iraq can begin to work together, setting out some basic principles of non-interference and respect for sovereignty. And because all of those states now have ties either with Iran and or Israel, they can work to manage these tensions between these two countries and gradually involve them into processes that can lower the temperature of regional tensions. We also propose that through the creation of what we call a Middle East Forum, that they can develop working groups, somewhat similar to the OSCE model, that focus on pragmatic areas like climate change, emergency response, for example, economic ties, that again, through these fora, countries can get to know each other, build trust, work collaboratively, and over time, perhaps find ways to include Iran, include Israel, and over decades, bring down the temperature of tensions across the region.
As you know, there was a perception that a lot of Arab states in the Gulf were pursuing closer ties with Israel in order to contain Iran. Certainly, the outbreak of the war in Gaza has tempered a lot of the enthusiasm for engaging with Israel. Do you think that a lot of these states are trying to maintain a balance? Do you think they still see a longer-term strategic opportunity with Israel? How do you think these states see their strategic needs going forward? And where does a perception of the U.S. future role in the region fit into that?
Well, it does look like there are two normalization tracks underway in the region. There's the outreach to Iran and the restoration of ties with the UAE and Saudi Arabia that have been underway for a number of years now. They're progressing slowly but steadily. There are limits to the progress, obviously, because U.S. sanctions prevent both of these countries from investing heavily in the Iranian economy, but that's perhaps a leverage point for those Gulf states. Simultaneous to that, we have, since 2020, seen the UAE and Bahraini normalization with Israel that has, of course, gained momentum with the Biden administration's doubling down on this process. I think that's still very much in the cards, but probably can't be delivered in the timelines that the Biden administration seeks to achieve. I think over a longer period of time, most of the Gulf states, including Saudi Arabia, have understood that regional stability requires a different tactic. Conflicts can't just be managed. Conflicts now need to be addressed, if not solved, in order to allow the region to grow economically, and particularly for countries like Saudi Arabia, with Vision 2030 being so dependent on foreign direct investment. And this isn't just, let's say, the conflict in Syria or the conflict in Yemen, two conflicts that are just being managed, not addressed in any meaningful way, but clearly also the conflict in Palestine. So these are longer term projects that can't quickly be addressed, but the thinking has very much switched in the region. And that's a positive thing, but it requires a lot of investment at the leadership level and bureaucratic level. The Israeli-Saudi normalization process is very much hinged to Washington, and it's from the Saudi side very much about securing guarantees from the United States. And, this is where it gets complex. And from the Israeli side, I think that there is a bit of overconfidence that the normalization track will always be available to them. And so they can continue to prioritize their goals in Gaza, eliminating Hamas and addressing their security needs without immediately biting on normalization. And I think that that's an underestimation of priorities in the Gulf, and that could slow things down over time. This was a very long-winded way of saying that these are very complex issues. But in short, what's important to note is that Israel should not estimate that Gulf states are willing to use normalization to constrain normalization on Iran. On the other hand, the Gulf states need to manage both simultaneously in order to address their economic needs.
I've heard an increasing number of Western ambassadors to Iran saying this is a regime that's in a death spiral, and the Western role should be just to make sure that when it collapses, their fingerprints aren't all over it, that this is seen as a collapse of the government rather than another external plot to control Iran's future. Do you agree with the idea that the best Western policy toward Iran right now is a policy of benign neglect? Do you think the U.S. should be working with allies to increase economic pressure on the government, or do you think it's better to just let this thing collapse of its own internal contradictions?
I think the latter. I don't think that facilitating either directly or indirectly the collapse of the Iranian state is in American interests. I think that poses problems, particularly when there is uncertainty as to what comes next or who comes next. The United States, in my view, should prioritize constraining Iran's nuclear program, but not go out of its way to harm the state or the people, and instead give ordinary Iranians a space to try and manage what's coming next or insert themselves into what's coming next if we subscribe to the premise that the system is going to collapse. I think the system is certainly going to evolve. Obviously, we just don't know when, where, and how, but this system is institutional, and so it will be important to have key individuals in those institutions to help manage that process rather than perhaps to emulate what we saw in Iraq with a de-Baathification or a purge of institutions that I think can be very dangerous.
How optimistic are you that acute pressure can change what the United States and its allies consider to be destabilizing Iranian actions in the region? And to what extent is it just what the Iranians will do because they are weak and see themselves as having very few tools, and the asymmetrical ones are the ones they're going to use to try to deter the United States and its allies from more extreme actions against Iran?
I think that the United States is in a unique moment where they have a lot of influence over Iran. What we've seen since October 7th is that Iran can be deterred. The Iranian state itself has messaged that it doesn't seek broader conflict, and it has, under U.S. pressure, complied with red lines coming from Washington. At the same time, it is also very clearly demonstrating through these back channel negotiations that it wants to come to some new terms of engagement with the Biden administration, even for a few months. It is looking for some new arrangements that can be beneficial, be it monetarily or to prevent further conflict. So I think that sort of strategy for the rest of 2024 should be the one on the table. Diplomacy as well as deterrence has long been important balance in managing relations with adversaries. That is the way forward for now, particularly with the war in Gaza still very much underway and no real plan for what comes next. It's important not to press and trigger a broader regional conflict.
Sanam Vakil, thank you very much for joining us on Babel.
Thank you, Jon, for having me.
If the IRGC gains power relative to the clerical establishment in Iran, how might proxy groups in the region behave differently?
It's not clear how differently they would behave. It's not clear that the IRGC isn't really in the driver's seat when it comes to the activity of proxy groups right now. But there's a certain directness, a certain effectiveness and efficiency that I think a lot of people would see if the IRGC was in a more prominent position, partly because the IRGC has less complicated loyalties, a less complicated set of interests. The IRGC is a complicated group. It has a number of different ideological strains. It's not as avowedly religious as the clerical establishment is, but it's kind of about running protection rackets and making money. It's sort of easier to fathom what the IRGC's interests are and perhaps easier to make deals with the IRGC because I'm not sure there's anything ideologically they'd be opposed to as long as it advanced their institutional interests. You'd really be dealing with a much more straightforward institution than the clerical establishment, which partly because of the history of the Iranian clerical establishment is a very complicated bureaucracy. The differences between the clerics who want to be in government, the clerics who don't want to be in government, there's sort of a whole layer of legitimation I think makes it all quite complicated. It may be easier to deal with what's essentially a mafia-like group that is running protection rackets and is looking to maximize income. And then you can either hurt it or insulate it and deal with it that way.
This question came up of whether or not Iran could eventually become kind of like a liberal garrison state, like the IRGC takes over. After the death of Mahsa Amini a couple of years ago and the protests, a lot of experts on Iran suggested this wasn't really possible because the IRGC and the clerical establishment is essentially two sides of the same coin. And they essentially both benefit from the two pillars of the Islamic Republic's, I would say, waning legitimacy, which is resistance and religion. While there is that reality, I just got back from Saudi Arabia. It's an interesting thought experiment because Saudi Arabia has initiated through MBS this enormous cultural shift. And people were telling me that the reason for this, in part, was due to the fact that MBS knew that the monarchy couldn't really survive withholding the things that many people around the world enjoy from their own population for much longer. And one could argue that Iran is even riper for such a shift. But I think the problem is that legitimacy component, right? If the resistance part of the pillar is lacking, then the religion kind of rises and vice versa. And so I think that somewhat affects the proxy group network of the IRGC. Currently, most of the proxy groups depend on Shia or Shia-adjacent populations throughout the world to recruit. If the IRGC moved away from that model, and in a sense they already have with supporting groups like Hamas, they're recruiting Syrians in southern Syria that are desperate for money. But if they move further in that direction, I actually think it's potentially more dangerous because then they are not limited to those populations. And that could be threatening for Sunni states in the region and other states around the world. But I don't think it necessarily needs to happen with the downgrading of the clerical establishment, because in a way, it's already starting to happen. They're starting to move beyond the sort of religious Shia mandate and go for more sort of mafioso ways to expand their power and influence in the region and arguably in the world, because we're seeing this in Sudan and elsewhere.
So let's talk about those other states in the region. During the interview, Sanam mentioned that Gulf states are simultaneously trying to manage normalization with Iran and Israel. Has the war in Gaza created an opportunity for Iran to secure inroads with the Gulf faster than Israel?
I think that's a really interesting question. I would say less so for Iran and more the Gulf states might be looking to reduce tensions and really take themselves out of the middle of a potential war between Israel and Iran. And to do so, they would essentially need to keep maintaining relations between both of these states to a certain degree. But I think what's more surprising, actually, about the past 7 months is how little has changed. We've seen states that have normalized sort of playing down their normalization, but they're not rescinding it. And Saudi Arabia has not said they won't do it altogether. They are just trying to get as much as they can out of the United States for any kind of normalization. And so you don't see a really stark change in rhetoric on the part of Arab states. That said, I think there's a realism to this, that everyone, including the United States, Iran, even Hezbollah, are trying to take down tension so that they can actually be able to respond better to any kind of potential crisis that really could become inflamed at any moment.
It seems to me that all the Gulf states tend to take a quite long-term approach to both Iran and to Israel and to the United States and to China for that matter. Many of them have leaders who expect to be in power in 30 years. And so they don't feel a need to respond to the street right now. They don't feel a need to respond to the Netanyahu government because they expect to long survive Netanyahu. I think they also assume that Iran is going to pose a durable threat to their security. A lot of what they're doing is tactically backing off from normalization with Israel, and that certainly met Iran's near-term goals, but strategically feeling a need to preserve the option to deepen ties with Israel, to insulate themselves from Iranian misbehavior in the future. I think keeping a line open to China, but also trying to have as strong a line to the United States as they possibly can. All that suggests to me that they are being deeply strategic and long-term, and they are looking beyond the Gaza conflict because they expect to rule long past the Gaza conflict, which frankly is not the way either Prime Minister Netanyahu or President Abbas or perhaps President Biden are dealing with that conflict right now.
Sanam mentioned that Iran's acting foreign minister has greater experience in nuclear negotiations, greater exposure to U.S. officials. How might this affect the United States' ability to constrain Iran's nuclear program?
I'm not sure that Iran is going to be focused on negotiating over the nuclear program. As I've spoken, not only my conversation with Sanam, but also my conversation with Western diplomats in Iran, I think that the nuclear program's purpose is to be an irritant they can regulate and turn up and down. But I don't think they intend to resolve that issue at this point. Their strategy, which was not decided by the former foreign minister, was certainly implemented by him, not decided by the president, but implemented by him. The strategy was look east, engage more deeply with China. They have a stronger and strengthening relationship with Russia, which is commercially valuable to them. You see an effort to improve relations with the immediate neighbors. You see an effort to build up this axis of resistance. I think those are the tools that the leadership broadly has embraced. In many ways, the acting foreign minister isn't really well suited at the outset to advance those, but I think that's still what the decision's been. And so either he can learn those files or somebody who knows those files will prosecute them. But I don't think that the current foreign minister is going to be able to redirect how Iran thinks about its global approach. And in part, that's because you could make a very good argument that Iran's approach has been a winning strategy for the last year and a half. And the idea of pursuing another agreement with the United States, with the Biden administration, that's perhaps on its way out the door, the uncertainty of the Trump administration. I mean, we'll see what that looks like if it happens. But I don't think the Iranians are willing to invest anything in that right now. Maybe a little bit. You saw Bagheri Khani was indirectly negotiating with a U.S. team just before the helicopter crash. I think maybe do some tactical negotiations in the near term, but strategically, I think the Iranians are going to keep betting on the course that's been paying off for them and modulating the tension created by the nuclear program, because that's the purpose of the nuclear program.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And you saw this with the invitation of the UN atomic watchdog to Tehran for negotiations and the sort of low-level US-Iran talks that were ongoing. I would say that that will continue at a superficial level, especially as Iran is facing these threats from Israel, as well as protests that have occurred relatively recently in Iran, and an aging but apparently very exuberant supreme leader as well in Khamenei. I think that Iran might continue to use those kinds of negotiations to, again, take the tensions down a little bit while it's facing these internal weaknesses, but not in any sort of real way, but almost superficially to try to take out some of the outside sources of threats by the U.S. And I think the best way to do that, especially in a democratic administration, is to reignite nuclear talks.
Fundamentally, this is an Iranian government that has concluded that there really is no real upside to the American relationship. And the thing you can most easily adjust is how you deal with the nuclear program, how you deal with watchdogs, how you can crank up tensions or lower tensions. And so that's instrumentalizing the nuclear program, not because you intend to give it away, because you don't trust what you'd get in exchange for giving it away. And I think there's a legitimate Iranian argument. They've tried that, and look what it got them. And so the question is, when you're weak, when your economy is ailing, when you're surrounded by all sorts of enemies, how can you put yourself in a position where people want to give you things? And it seems to me that the nuclear program becomes the thing to trade on, because it's a source of leverage for a country that feels has very little leverage. But in general, it has played a very artful game for the last year and a half through its proxies, its arms sales to Russia. It's managed to do remarkably well for a small and weak country, acting like a more powerful country. And for an Iranian government that's happy to get through the day, they have a lot more good days than bad days.
So it seems clear that Iran is seeking these new terms of engagement with the United States. In what areas could the United States engage with Iran in a way that doesn't undermine its long-term interests?
I think that's a good question, and it might change dramatically in a few months with the U.S. election. But I think Sanam is right about the United States needing to not have fingerprints on any potential weaknesses within the Iranian establishment itself. That said, there's a lot that the United States could do in the region to take down the tensions that Iran feeds off of and that Iranian proxy groups feed off of. And that specifically is related to Palestine, but also Yemen and Syria, and really more actively engaging in those conflicts to ensure that the Iranian proxy network doesn't have full throttle access to the region and beyond. That's an area where I think the United States could legitimately play a very useful purpose, trying to talk about weakening the Iranian regime while it's already weak and these kinds of things. I think they play to the conspiracies and the real story of the Iranian regime and many other states in the region. And so that would be a mistake. The question is whether or not the United States is committed enough to this region to really delve into the nitty-gritty of those very complicated and devastating conflicts. But I think what the last few months have shown is that they need to be, not just for humanitarian reasons, but also to sort of take the oxygen out of this Iranian proxy network, which I would argue is where it gets most of its strength from.
It feels to me like there's also a danger of getting too involved in too much diplomacy where the Iranians have too many vetoes over what happens. I think there needs to be, on the one hand, diplomacy, but there also needs to be a clear sense of limits and American responses to Iran transgressing those limits. We saw that after the Tower 22 attack in Jordan. I think this is an Iranian government that does understand limits when the United States asserts them. We're going to have to accept that there are going to be times when limits are going to be hard to make work. And I think we're seeing that in Yemen. And I talked to people who've spent a lot of time looking at this problem. And their view is that the Houthis are going to continue doing what they do for a very long time. And so every problem doesn't have a solution, but there needs to be a clear belief on the Iranian side that, on the one hand, exceeding American limits will get a swift and sure response, but also some compliance with the United States will also get a different response. There's no question in my mind that the Iranians are intrigued at the possibilities that a Trump presidency would have for them having a face-to-face negotiation with President Trump that they think will get them something. Whether that's accurate, inaccurate, I don't know. But to me, it highlights the fact that really the Iranian strategy is not to resolve any of this ever. The Iranian strategy is to be in negotiations, because when they're in negotiations, when things are in play, they think they can get things. And the way they most often get things is not by good behavior, but bad behavior. Because of that, we need to understand where that goes, understand the limits of it, and also understand that if we don't set our own limits to Iranian behavior, we're going to have a creeping of bad behavior, creeping destabilization of the region that's going to undermine not only American interests, but the interests of American allies and partners. And it doesn't have to be overwhelmingly costly to reinforce limits, but I think there does need to be a clearer sense of limits.
Thanks for joining me, Jon and Natasha.
Thank you, Leah.
Thanks, Leah.
Thanks for listening to Babel. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe to the podcast on iTunes or Spotify or wherever you listen to podcasts. You can find more analysis on this topic linked in the show notes on the CSIS website, and you can find us on Twitter at CSIS Mideast.